In the world of property management, the relationship between the tenant and the owner is not always pleasant. There can be a handful of instances of landlord harassment or even tenant harassment. Both of these can count as a violation of the lease agreement and will likely lead to legal action. Today we'll be focusing specifically on examples of landlord harassment as well as things that can be done to deter the harassment. Welcome back, Loopers. My name is Sydney. I'm a content creator here at DoorLoop. Let's go ahead and hop right into today's video with what landlord harassment is defined as. Landlord harassment is known as any aggressive technique used by the landlord to scare or intimidate the tenant. By doing this, the landlord is directly infringing upon the tenant's right to quiet and peaceful enjoyment of the property. This could include a number of different actions, which we'll be discussing later in the video. Most of them, however, have the goal of forcing the tenant to move from the rental unit and forcing them not to pursue legal action. But in order for a landlord to be guilty of tenant harassment, they must engage in continuous harassment. This means one example of bad behavior will typically not convince a court that the landlord is guilty. To be considered guilty in the court, the landlord must display a pattern of disbehavior and the tenant must also have a way to prove it. And now that we know what landlord harassment is, it can still be difficult to pinpoint exactly what counts and what doesn't count as harassment. Since the line can be thin at times, it's important to have some ideas of what can be considered landlord harassment. In the next two sections, I'll be going over examples of landlord harassment as well as examples that are not landlord harassment. So first off are examples of landlord harassment. Shutting off utilities. When a landlord wants to force a tenant out of a rental property, they may resort to shutting off the utility services. This could include gas, electricity, water, or any other utilities of the property. In many states, this is considered a self-help eviction or landlord retaliation. And in many states, it is also completely illegal. If you want to learn more about self-help evictions or other eviction laws, make sure to check out our playlist on evictions or our playlist on landlord-tenant laws here on this YouTube channel. Our next example is illegal entry. Landlords are typically required to give proper notice to the tenants if they plan on entering the property. If they don't give this notice, they do not have legal access to enter the property. If a landlord does enter the tenant's unit without notice, especially more than once, it's considered harassment. Another form of landlord harassment is if they refuse to provide necessary repairs or maintenance. Doing this can be a form of forcing the tenant to vacate the property. Thus, it could be considered a self-help eviction, which again is completely illegal. This is especially true if tenants pay rent consistently and have not missed a single rent payment. Another example is changing the locks. In an effort to force the tenant out of the property, the landlord may change the locks to the property. When a landlord does this, they are prohibiting the tenant from entering the property, which is another form of a self-help eviction, which once again is illegal. And of course, I have to include spontaneously raising rent. In most states, landlords are required to give proper notice of at least 30 days when they're raising the tenant's rent. When a landlord raises rent without notice or too often, it can be with the intention of harassing tenants. And lastly is just personal harassment. One of the worst ways that a tenant can be harassed by the landlord is personally. This means in the form of physical threatening remarks, sexual harassment, verbal harassment, or anything else related to the tenant personally. When a landlord does this, they are not only violating the rental agreement, they are breaking the law. This kind of behavior typically warrants legal action, even if the tenant violates the lease agreement in a different way. So now we know some of the examples of landlord harassment. Let's go over some examples of things that are not landlord harassment. The first example on this list is when a landlord must enter the property in case of emergency. In these cases, the landlord does not have to provide notice and can go ahead and enter the property. One example of this is if the fire alarm goes off on the property. If the landlord notices, they have a reason to believe that there could be a fire in the property and can enter to see if there's anything wrong. Another example that is not harassment is raising the rent. Although this was included in the previous list, raising rent is actually permitted as long as there is a proper notice provided. If the landlord gives proper notice that the rent is going to be raised, they can raise it to a certain percentage. In most states, this notice is about 30 days. Anything less can be considered illegal and thus harassment. Another example of something a landlord can do that is not considered harassment is file a legal eviction. This eviction can be related to the tenant's rent payment, illegal activity, tenant harassment, or anything else that warrants an eviction. Once again, just check out that playlist we have on evictions state by state. It is important to note that although evictions are legal, it's important to do everything legally. If not, there can be legal trouble throughout the process of the eviction. And lastly is changing the locks legally. Although I did mention this in the previous section as well, there are some cases where it's allowed. One common example is in the case of domestic violence. When there is a case of domestic violence on record, it is in the landlord's interest to change the locks. By doing so, they're making sure that the violator does not have access to the property. This is usually allowed and even encouraged by the current tenants. So now that you know some examples of harassment and some examples of what is not harassment, let's quickly go over some of the things that tenants can do to prevent or stop the behavior. First of all, document everything. Ever since the first incident of harassment, everything should be documented. This includes every communication, meeting, inspection, and anything else that regards the landlord. In these documents, you should include the date, time, and nature of the incident. By doing this, you are essentially building a case against the landlord in case of a legal dispute, which is discussed next. Once the tenant has a handful of incidents documented, they can file a formal complaint. Once a complaint is filed, the landlord will be investigated and the government agency will determine if harassment has occurred. If the landlord is found guilty, they will probably face some legal consequences. Although every jurisdiction is different, these consequences typically mean paying a fine for damages. Before moving on to legal action, it may be a good idea to ask the landlord to break the lease. This offer is typically accepted as the landlord usually harasses the tenant to get them out of the property. It is important to note, however, that the tenant should not face a financial loss here. If the tenant is trying to break the lease due to harassment, they should not have to pay any extra fines or anything to do so. If the landlord is demanding payment, they can move on to the last step. If all else fails, the tenant can find legal help. This means hiring a lawyer or an attorney to represent them in a lawsuit. Typically, this would be the last stage, as a landlord will be legally obligated to take action if found guilty. If the tenant wins this case, the landlord will most likely be forced to pay a large sum of money and maybe even cover the tenant's legal fees and attorney fees. I hope you are never in this situation, but if you are, I really hope that this video helped you out. And if you feel comfortable, then leave your situation down in the comments to help others going through the same things. I hope that your situation is resolved soon, and if this video helped you, then give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more helpful tips. I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye!